Next, from the Illinois Manufacturers Association's Business Day, Jim Vandehei, the co-founder and CEO of Axios Media and former executive editor of Politico, gives a speech on the Trump administration so far and what is real about and not real regarding the Trump White House. This runs about 1 hour.
It's a pleasure to be here. Unlike those politicians you're going to go see who are going to give you all those spin and weasel words, I'm a man who stands by the courage of my convictions, so I have a confession. I'm not just a cheesehead. I'm a Bucks fan, a Brewers fan, and a diehard Packer fan. Yeah. See, now I have nowhere to go but up. Now I'll suck up to you for a second, and then we'll start. But you should be proud that you're business owners. I'll say I was a journalist until 10 years ago, thought that what I would do for the rest of my life. And now I'm on the second company that we started. We created one that grew to about 500 or 600 people, and now I think we have 110 employees in the last year and a half with Axios. And it's hard running a company, and I think often people don't appreciate how tough it is. Obviously, there's lots of great benefits in doing it, but thank you for doing that. I think like owning a company, creating jobs is a big deal, even if everyone doesn't always appreciate it. The economy doesn't work without it. Like you said, I wish I had I wish I could actually get back to the era where we could have a prepared speech. There's probably things have happened even in the hour that we've been in here that would alter what I have to say. So there'll be no reruns other than Rick has seen me speak before. There's only one story that I'll repeat because it answers the one question that I get most when I speak to audiences like this. And the question is, when did politics go batshit crazy? And I think I was there at the creation, and there was a very specific moment. You know, social media's heating up, cable TV's heating up, and it's the 2012 election. And Sarah Palin is going to run for president. And the early polls show that she's leading in the polls, and she could be the nominee for the Republican Party. So we did a piece at the time, I was at Politico, talking to all the people who worked for Bush and all the establishment types in Washington. A lot of it was anonymous sources, but they were really critical of her, really critical of the idea that she could be the standard bearer for the Republican Party. So we write the piece, and Sarah Palin doesn't like it. So she goes on Fox News to say, you know what, I think I'd like to use my anonymous sources to say that Jim is a piece of crap. She then takes to Twitter, she goes, I'd like to use anonymous sources to elaborate. Jim Vandehei is a homophobe, child molesting, tax evading, anti-deadite, puppy kicking porn producer. Yes, she said that, and yes, a few of you thought she should be president. So right around that time, we're doing Morning Joe, and right after Palin was running, I think people forget, Donald Trump was thinking of running then as well. And so I was on the show, and this is right when Trump says he's thinking of running, and he's starting to surge in the polls. And I was on, and I was like, there's no way this guy could be the Republican nominee. He's a liberal Democrat. He's given money to Hillary. He's pro-abortion. Like, come on, how could he possibly be the nominee? I get off, and I get a text from Maggie Haberman, who's now at the New York Times, who was working for us at the time. And she says, hey, that Donald just called and wanted to pass along that he thinks you're a big piece of shit. So right then you start to see this flavor of maybe modern politics isn't that weird after all. It's just an exaggeration of where we were a couple of years ago. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about Trump. It's funny, Axios is not just politics, about 25% of what we do. We do world coverage, we do business, we do technology, AI, robotics, basically any topic that's going to change the future. But every big topic ends up becoming a Trump story. It's amazing how much he can suck up the oxygen in any individual topic. Where I think that I could be most useful is just to give you a sort of a clinical take on like what's real and what's not real about the Trump White House. There's so much hyperventilating out there. We're blessed that because of the reporters we have amazing access into this White House. The truth is, I covered the presidency for the Wall Street Journal and the Post before we started Politico. We will learn more this week in real time about what the president is doing, thinking, and plotting than I would have learned in a year of covering Obama or Bush. Because everybody around the president leaks. Everybody, including the president. I'm just thinking that I like get such a kick out of it. The fake media, I hate the media. There has never been a president in the history of our fine country who's liked the media more than Donald Trump. He's media obsessed, loves reporters, loves the game, hates the coverage, but is obsessed with the coverage. And he can't help himself late at night in terms of hopping on the phone and talking to the 15 or 20 friends he has in New York, who then in turn call reporters to tell him what's on the Donald's mind. And so you just get this lens. And he, unlike any president, we were talking about President Obama, nobody leaked around President Obama. They were all so loyal, and you would never leak. Everyone around Donald Trump leaks, and he doesn't care. He honestly does not care. The only time he cares is if you make yourself bigger than the big guy. That's why the day that Steve Bannon's face appeared on the cover of Time magazine, it was crystal clear he was dead. He was gone. That it might not be imminent, but it'd be gone, because the cover on Time magazine, and the president is one of the few people in America who still looks at the hardcover of Time magazine, it said sort of, it was like the puppet master, sort of the shadow president. That you cannot do. But if you're just talking and leaking even about stuff that most presidents would cringe at or scream about, he just does not care. Early on, he gathered his staff and even said, think of each day like this is a TV show, that every day is an episode. And how do we make sure that people are tuning into the episode, and that the episode is written in a way that goes with the script I want, where I'm the main character, I'm the main focus, and I'll be the main critic of it. And as long as you do that, we'll be able to sort of control the media on our terms. He's kind of done that, right? He's able, for better or worse, every day is a Trump day. And he knows, he can, so we had this amazing story a couple of months ago where there's 5 people who get the actual presidential schedule. They put out a presidential schedule to sort of the masses, but there's one that just goes to the 5 or 6 inner circle. One of them leaked all of them to us because they wanted to get it out that from 6 a.m. until 11, he was having executive time, which meant he wasn't coming into the office till about 10:30 or 11 because he wanted 5 hours upstairs to literally watch Fox and Friends and tweet. And if you watch, you could see it still plays out to this day. In the morning, his tweets always follow what's on the cables. So he hate watches Morning Joe, and he love watches Fox and Friends, and then reacts to it. And we could snicker at that, and I would say I often do snicker at that, but there is sort of in his own way, a brilliance to it, because he's able to soak up what people are going to obsess about in that day, and he knows how to very quickly change the subject. He knows how to throw chum into the water so all the media fish go jumping at it, and he controls the day. So when you think of, what's real and what's not real about him? The thing that's not real, if you watch the coverage, there's so much, in some ways the media is destroying itself in terms of the hyperventilating coverage of him. And not even, a lot of it is serious, and I feel very passionately about a lot of it, but the sneering and the condescension, or even you watch some of the cable shows and they cover him like he has dementia and he's knocking into walls walking around the White House. Donald Trump is no different today than he was a year ago, than he was 10 years ago, than he was 30 years ago. In fact, he never really changes. His techniques are almost identical to the ones he used in New York when he was manipulating the tabloids 30 years ago. When he won, one of his friends called us and said, "You want to know who doesn't change and who everyone thinks is going to change but never will change?" He said, "A billionaire with his name on a bunch of buildings. He's just not going to change." And he hasn't. Hell, he might be the first person to ever have the presidency who thinks he had to downgrade given the quality of his house and his plane today versus before. He's no different. The presidency, usually, you look at President Obama, President Bush in particular, it really grays you for a reason. You're running the most powerful country in the history of mankind. It changes you. It humbles you. Not Trump. He's no different today than he was on Election Day. And in fact, he might even be more Trump today than he was on Election Day. Because the thing that is real is he really does run it like Trump Incorporated. We'll get to the Mueller stuff, but the reason so much sloppiness happened is he's just used to running like a family business where he's the man calling the shots, and he wants to have 4 or 5 vice presidents who are yes men working for him. He doesn't want a traditional White House. He doesn't want a Secretary of State who's giving him advice that he doesn't like. There's a reason that his current chief of staff is really only chief of staff in title. He's almost, not powerless, but he's a very, very, has very little power internally. The president doesn't want a chief of staff. He doesn't want a nanny looking over his shoulder telling him when to go to a meeting or when not to say something. He wants to do what the hell he wants to do when he wants to do it. And every time someone says, well, you can't do that, it'll kill you, and he'll be like, okay, then who's the president? Like, I won, you didn't. And so he's more Trump than ever. The thing where that you might think is cynical in the coverage of him that is real, like, he's obviously not reading and often thinking deeply about topics. I think he himself would say he's very intuitive. When we interviewed him heading into the presidency, we were asking him about his intelligence briefings, because during the transition to power, you get access to top secret information, and you start to get briefed up so that when you take office, you're fully prepared to deal with the complexities of Iran or North Korea. And I was asking him, like, well, how do you get your information? Like, because it usually came in big binders, big books. I don't like that. Like smaller binders? No, like one page. Like one full page? No, we could take a couple of bullet points on a page. I'm like, on North Korea or Iran? But that's how he does it. He doesn't want to dig deep into the policies. And it's one of the reasons that he lost Gary Cohn, or that he loses people who sort of came in thinking pretty seriously about, hey, no, this is what the trade deficit actually means, and this is what economic policy. He doesn't care. He wants to play by his gut. And so I'd say he's more Trump than ever before. What's interesting about him and interesting about the coverage is that until this week, I'd actually say that if you had gone to bed on Election Day and you had shut off Twitter and you had not watched Fox and Friends and you just looked at what actually happened, it hasn't been that radical of a presidency. It just felt radical. Just look at what he did last year. The tax cut was not that different than a tax cut you would get from President Paul Ryan. The regulations that they went after are not different than you would have gotten from a President Mike Pence. Going after health care the way he did, no different than any other sort of mainstream Republican president. You could argue that pulling out of the climate change deal was sort of more Trumpian, but even that is something that obviously could be changed over time and wasn't that much of a shock. It was basically a fairly conventional presidency. So he would talk big, and he would say radical things, but he actually in action didn't do that much. Gorsuch on the court, other people on the court, pretty traditional mainstream conservative picks. So there was the Trump, the rhetoric, bombastic, whoa, my God, the world's going to end, and like, oh, kind of a yawn, sort of regular conservative politics. The question right now is that changing? Are we now not just seeing Trump be Trump in action in terms of how he carries himself in the White House, but now in policy? And the reason I say that this week, in some ways, is starting to be a pivotal part to answering that is that getting out of the deal with Iran, like pulling out of the Iranian deal. Like, that's something he promised on the campaign trail. It's something most conservatives, or a lot of conservatives, would have been opposed to. It's certainly his defense secretary opposed to it. But now he's doing it. And so I would say that is keeping with the promise of sort of America first that he talked about on the campaign. Building the wall. He continues to say, I'm going to shut down the government this fall if I don't get the wall. He might do it this time, because I do think there's a couple of things he talked about on the campaign trail that he wants to be able to go back if he runs again to say, I did. I think an issue that affects all of you. There's been a lot of bombast on trade. There's been some action on trade. The question is, does he have caveats? Does he have carve-outs? Does he strike a deal with the Europeans in terms of exemptions on how we deal with steel and aluminum? Does he strike a deal with the Chinese? His instinct is he don't want a damn deal. His instinct is like, I'm fine with a trade war. And so the question will be, if he actually follows through with it, then you could say a month from now, like, yeah, it's a real deal. Like, this really is Trump's America First vision materializing in itself. What's interesting about the coverage of him and the reality of him is that we're at peak Trump. We're at peak Trump in terms of loving him and hating him. In terms of, like, it's almost like public, probably in this room, everybody you know, people's views seem to be unmovable, unshakable. For all of the drama, all of the stories, all of the holy cow, he did what? His numbers have not changed. It's not like they haven't changed this month. They haven't changed since June of 2016. He's been at or about 40% favorable ratings since June of 2016. In the last 2 months, where you've had lots of volatility and lots of action in politics, it hasn't moved at all. Like, people are locked in, and it's not going to change. He will be at 40% until the day he leaves office. How do we know that? Because he's tested the proposition. He's done every single thing we say, you cannot do that in politics. He does it, and he does not pay a price with his base. His base loves him, partly because they hate us. They hate big business, big media, big government. And he was a middle finger at the election to everybody. He's a middle finger today. Those people aren't moving. As a matter of fact, his support with the Republican base is stronger than ever. I think 85% of Republicans are with him. So he's not an anomaly. He is the Republican Party. He might not be sort of in a sort of a corporate Republican we're used to, but he is the party. And I think he gets aided by the media and his critics, because there's so many people now have this derangement syndrome. And you can see it. It's like people shake and they froth a little bit, and they're like, he's got his finger on the button, he's got his finger on the button. And there's this hysteria that I think only benefits him. Only benefits him. And so people, often you'll watch shows or you'll read stuff and you assume, oh my God, he's going to be impeached tomorrow, or he's going to be gone in a year. One, he's not going to be impeached. Not unless there's a radical change in the Congress. What people don't seem to understand is that impeachment requires a majority of the House of Representatives to actually impeach him. Republicans run the House. It would require a supermajority of the Senate to remove him. There's not a Republican in Washington who isn't retiring, or in John McCain's case, like facing terminal cancer, that will speak out against him. So the idea that the Republican Party is going to turn on Trump based on every single thing that we've seen to date is laughable. They're with him. They might not like him, but they are with him. And so the big question will be, come down to the election, right? Like, do Democrats end up winning the House? Can they win the Senate? Are there big enough majorities? Because that would change things profoundly. There's three things when you talk to people inside the White House that I would say concern them, that are in terms of, like, when you're thinking about business decisions, to factor into your risk profile, which would be one. I'd say the number one concern for people on the inside is that they have a hell of a time recruiting talent. In the White House and in agencies, basically, like, the best of the best are not coming into government. They feel that they won't have enough power. Certainly the people you really want on the inside, they sort of watched what happened with Gary Cohn or Rex Tillerson, people who've taken breaks from their career to go in and not had the power that they had hoped for. They know that at the agency level, the agencies aren't fully staffed, they're not operating the way they should, so they're having a hell of a time getting talent in. Why does that matter? It might not matter now, but almost every presidency is shaped by a crisis that we don't anticipate. And that's when government actually does have to have the right butts in the right seats to be able to respond to a cyber attack, or, God forbid, a war with North Korea, or the Iranians doing something crazy in response to the decision this week. That's when it can matter. And I'd say people on the inside are very scared that they don't have the right people to be able to make those decisions if they had to. The second thing that worries them is the trade war. Like, does this escalate beyond where they want it to go? Does China basically take a strong position and say, yeah, the hell, we're taking the long view. You want to have a trade war? It might be a little bit disruptive for us. It would be much more disruptive for the United States in the short term. And does this escalate into something that we're not anticipating? That's a reasonable probability internally, given what the president's instincts are and the people who are working on trade policy. The third is North Korea. Being very sympathetic to the president, like, he inherited a mess that almost nobody anticipated. When President Obama, the last time he had a conversation with Donald Trump, he said to him, he said, the one and only issue that's going to define your presidency is North Korea. Well, why is that? Because suddenly we all thought we had 3 to 5 years before the Koreans would be able to have a nuclear weapon on a missile that could reach our shores, and suddenly the intelligence community is saying it could be less than a year. So now you took a crisis that was on the horizon that's an urgent crisis. The president, I'd say McMaster when he was at the NSC, certainly Bolton now at the NSC, most of the people working on the National Security Council are with the president that they're not going to allow the Koreans to have that weapon with that nuclear payload that can hit our shores. which means if these peace talks don't work with the Koreans, and most of the time these peace talks don't work, well, you might have a much higher probability of a confrontation that could be extremely catastrophic. It's a very hard place to do a tactical strike against. It's a very hard place to do something where retaliation couldn't be high. So I would say that chances, if that fail, internally, people certainly worry and think a lot more about the outflow of that than probably the public thinks about. So shifting gears to the election. So the big question now is you have Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And that's amazing power. Washington is effectively ungovernable unless you have all-party control. I would say, like, if I were a president and I had all-party control, I would hook myself up to a vat of Red Bull and not go to bed and re-engineer the country in your image, because it's really hard to get to a point where you have the power to get stuff through the House and the Senate. If the House were to flip, in particular, or the Senate is to flip, the big short-term consequence is that suddenly you have Democrats who have the power to be able to start to issue subpoenas and really sort of make it all about scandal, even more than it's about scandal today. And so if you look at the House, there's a reason Republicans are worried. And if you talk to most Republican leaders in Washington, they would say they expect to lose the House of Representatives. Why? The reason is that there's just so many seats in play right now that are held by Republicans. They're looking at the off-year elections, including yesterday, and in almost every off-year election to date since Trump took office, Democrats have way outperformed what they've done in previous elections, meaning many more people are turning out than had in previous elections, often by about an average of 16 points, which means that women in particular, who were sort of worked up about Trump and worked up about the Me Too movement, are now translating that actually into sustained voting pattern. And that's the only things you can look at when you're thinking about a wave election, about whether or not you can predict the outcome, is are you seeing a trend that's carrying itself across race after race? You're definitely seeing that happen. When that happens, momentum begets money. So Democrats are able to raise more money than they could typically raise. They're able to recruit better candidates. I don't think Paul Ryan retires and resigns as Speaker if he thinks he's going to have a robust majority. I don't think these Republican committee chairmen, leave town when they finally have power if they think they're going to hold that power. So Republicans are very nervous about controlling the House. Doesn't mean they definitely lose the House, but if you're betting, woman or man, like, you bet that they probably do lose the House, which then probably does make Nancy Pelosi Speaker. The Senate's hard, really hard for Democrats to win back, but not impossible. Republicans have a massive built-in advantage in this election in that there's 10 Democrats who are up for re-elections in states that Trump won. And Trump continues to be very popular in those states. 5 of those states he won by double digits. So it's hard. You'd have to win all those seats and defeat some Republicans. Doable, and probably looks more possible today than it did 3 or 4 months ago, but still hard. So the most likely outcome is you end up with a massively divided government. And probably 2 years of sort of an escalation of the investigatory madness. And probably not that much legislating, which can be good depending what you want done, and not good if you want activity in D.C. The big thing that hangs over the whole presidency that sort of sucks up as much attention as Trump is Robert Mueller. I mean, it's the question everybody wants to know, like, does he have the goods on Donald Trump? And as somebody who spends way too much time thinking about this, I'm all over the place. There's days where I feel like there's no doubt that if he wants to build a case of obstruction of justice around the firing of James Comey, I don't think that's going to be a tremendously difficult case to make. I don't think that wants to bring that case forward. I think that he knows that he's looking at the politics of it and looking at the fact that Republicans control the House and Senate. The only way that there's going to be activity on his findings is if he can find irrefutable proof of mischief between Trump and the Russians before the election, during the transition and post-presidency. That's a lot. There's a lot of smoke out there, and I would say there's even a lot of signals of fire out there. But there's not been a direct link in any of these stories of collusion, and collusion isn't a crime, but it's the things that flow from collusion that are a crime, that are linked directly to Trump. And so you'd ask me a month ago, I'd say, hey, there's probably a report from Mueller. It'll be one hell of a read. It might be one of the best reads anybody will see in politics, but probably doesn't lead necessarily to impeachment. The big turning point, and the thing to watch if you are into this drama, is Michael Cohen. When they raided his office, so Michael Cohen is a lawyer. I mean, he's not just a lawyer. Like, we knew Trump before he ran. Like, when you wanted to talk to Trump, you talked to Michael Cohen. Next to Trump's office is Michael Cohen. He is like his fixer, his lawyer, the guy, we sort of call him the Rosetta Stone. He knows everything. So when the FBI raided him, there's a reason that was the most panicked Donald Trump has ever been. Because Cohen is the kind of connective tissue between what's happening in politics and what happened in his business life. And there's a reason Trump has said the red line for me is if Mueller ever goes after my business dealings, that's when I would consider firing him, because he doesn't want people digging in there. Cohen allows Mueller to dig into it. And the stories over the last 24 hours you couldn't make up if you were writing House of Cards. This idea that Michael Cohen now apparently had a $500,000 slush fund that appears to have been paid for by a Russian oligarch that was sanctioned by Trump that paid off a porn star. Like, you can't make this stuff up. It's funny, it's like some of these things, like, they happen, you're like, could you just insert Bush or Obama, even like one small thing happening? Like, imagine just like, go back in time 3 years ago, and Barack Obama today admitted that his right-hand person paid off a porn star. Like, you'd be impeached just for that. And that's not even going to make the final cut. And so that's why and then we'll go to Q&A, that's why I'm so fascinated in the Mueller report. And it goes to a question Rick was asking when we were eating lunch. He was asking about Mark Zuckerberg in his testimony before Congress. What's so interesting in that Mueller report is just going to be it's just such a delicious read, and it's going to be such an artifact of this moment in history, because it's going to pull together everything. It's going to pull together the Trump victory. It's going to pull together the Russians trying to manipulate our election. And it's going to pull in the easy manipulation of our social networks, where we basically, all of us had turned over all of our data to these big companies that could be easily manipulated by a foreign entity for a couple of rubles. Like, that's a great story. It's a fascinating story, and it really is a story of our times, because so much of this presidency is about the technology, right? Like, you might hate Donald Trump, but think about what he did. Here is a guy who was a liberal Democrat. He was. And he basically hijacked a party and beat not a bunch of chumps. He beat what most people would say was kind of the best and brightest of the Republican Party. And he did it without really spending that much money, by violating every rule we thought existed in politics. And then he gets into the general election against the unbeatable Hillary Clinton, turns in like a couple of lackluster performances in debates, again, offends all these different voting groups, is said by all of us smarty pants that there's no way he can win, and he won. And the truth is, he probably could have won without spending a penny. Why? Because liberals built Twitter, and he was able to manipulate the hell out of it really successfully, and does it to this day. He has a direct line of communication to the American people. And that's the thing. That's where these coming together. That's why politics has changed forever. I don't know which direction it goes in, but the cost of entry is nothing. It does not cost money to get people to follow you on Facebook or on Twitter. You can suddenly have this direct line of communications to people, for better or worse. And by the way, it affects you. It affects your company. These same things that can be manipulated against politicians or manipulated by politicians can be done to screw up your company or to benefit your company. I always say, sometimes I do speeches to groups like this. It's only about sort of what we've learned building a business. And one of the things I always talk about is, and we do it with Axios, almost every company that's ever been built is almost your right-hand person next to the CEO or the founder is usually your CFO or your COO. I would say in the modern environment, your right-hand person should be a specialist in communications. Because if you're not communicating with your workers, especially your millennial workforce, your shareholders, your buyers, your customers, your potential customers, and you don't have a sophisticated understanding of how life is so much different on Snapchat than Google, than Facebook, than right-wing media, than left-wing media, it's going to affect you. It just requires a level of sophistication that was never dependent for most companies. And you're seeing it in politics. And that's why people, I'm sure when we get to Q&A, like, who's going to run, who's not going to? I don't know. Hell, I didn't think Donald Trump could ever win the presidency. I never thought the Republican Party would go along with some of his policies. Like, both parties are more malleable than any of us could have ever imagined. And we're in a period where people are so unhappy with politics, they're so unhappy with government, that really anything can happen. I mean, you go back that last election, and then I swear I'm going to shut up and do Q&A. If you go back that last election, on many of those topics, you weren't that far away from saying, why isn't Trump running with Sanders? You think about some of these issues, immigration, trade. In some ways, they're closer, and kind of the Clintons and Bushes were closer over here. Our politics is definitely in a period of mass transition. And then I'll leave on this. So one of the biggest changes is, for my lifetime, I would say politics here, I'd say politics in Europe, were defined by big government versus small government at its most elemental core. Do you like big government? Do you like no government or little government? I think what's changed is now the fundamental division line is, do you like life the way it was? Maybe even life the way it is. Or do you like change? Do you like more diversity? Do you like changing social policies? Do you like globalization? That's why I think there's so much more palpable friction in our politics. Because now you're getting down to very visceral issues, very emotional issues that go to the core of your identity. And we all want to think, like, the United States is so damn unique. It's no different if you went to Germany, or if you went to Italy, or if you went to London. They're having the exact same, it's the same issues. It's this collision of technology, globalization, and immigration. They're all hitting at the exact same time. And it's not a mistake that the outcome in almost all those cases is a massive rise of populism. They're totally running in correlation. That's not over. It's just beginning. You deal with it every day in the manufacturing thing. I always tell people when I talk, if I'm in New York, I say, this is a thought experiment, and you could do it here. Walk down any block and look in every store that you walk by and ask yourself, could a robot or a computer be doing that job better than a human right now? Well, it's startling how often the answer is yes. Well, then understand, especially for a publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to drive value, meaning you're going to do that. You're going to automate. You're going to take advantage of AI and robotics. So the change that stirred this current populism, it doesn't slow. In fact, once we hit a 5G system where everything can move at 100 times the speed now, it's going to move exponentially faster. And it's just going to require, I think, all of us to be a hell of a lot more agile, a hell of a lot more able to be able to roll with it and be able to make much quicker changes, much quicker decisions. That loops back to government, because the government as it's currently constituted, it's not capable of dealing with this. You saw it with those hearings with Zuckerberg. Those questions in many cases were moronic. They showed, they betrayed not an understanding of how technology works, how our data protection or lack thereof works. Imagine we're months away from having to regulate drones in the sky or driverless cars. Go to Chicago, it's going to be driverless. Whether it's 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but it's going to happen. How can government move quick enough to pick that up? And that's why when we sort of laugh about government and laugh about politics, it gets serious stuff. This stuff has to get fixed relatively quickly, or guess who's going to eat our lunch? The Chinese. They know this too. They're in the same race we are. And so hopefully politicians at the state level, at the federal level, figure that out. Hopefully we as people figure that out, and then we fix it. Let's do Q&A. And if there's anything I said that offended you, I push back. Other than the Packer thing. Well, I'd argue that too. I think might be a microphone around, or just...
I found it. Hi, Packer fan and shareholder, so...
You are?
I am.
God bless you.
I'm from Wisconsin. There's two in the room. So. Tom Wolf, BP America, small oil and gas and wind and solar company. Yep. We're in 72 countries. We're a global company. A lot of people in this room are thinking globally for the trade and opportunities it brings. There was a time where the Republican Party was a pro-trade, pro-globalization group. Its leader no longer is. Eventually, Donald Trump will be president of the United States. That could be months, 2.5 years, or 6.5 years, but I don't think he's going to change the Constitution and go for a third term. Can you tell me any ideas and Republicans you talk to who aren't fans of Donald Trump, whether they want to bring that pro-global, pro-trade back to the party or not? Is that a possibility?
I mean, I'm probably as stunned as you that Republicans flipped as quickly as they did on their trade stance. It goes to what I was talking about in terms of sort of grievance, right? The policy ultimately flows from good jobs left. Who do we blame? So you can blame Hispanics who are trying to come over the border. You can blame the Chinese for being able to drive much lower wages than we can. It feeds to an emotionalism that was able to shift, I think, the voting base of the Republican Party's views. I would say my guess is it could easily be shifted back, not in the next year, but certainly if the next Republican nominee starts to talk about globalizations, the opportunities, how can we turn these Vietnam and India and China into buyers of our goods, and ultimately to be able to have a growing economy over the long term. I think most people would say you need a big dimension of that. I mean, Trump's not wrong that in a lot of these trade deals we were getting screwed, and to be able to take a tougher stance, depending what the outcome is, could be very smart. Like, again, like there's not, like everyone wants to say it's madness, madness. There is some method to this. Like, you got to give him credit for the fact that we are having, the 3 hostages got returned by the Koreans today. He is going to have a meeting where it could, probably unlikely, but could result in the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Like, if he did that, like, give him the damn Nobel Peace Prize. Like, that would be a hell of an accomplishment that no one and no other administration was able to pull off. So the problem with the rhetoric on trade is it just has so many people so fired up that it's become so visceral, it'll be a harder shift because the party was not there before. And that's the thing that I have found most astonishing as someone who's watched this stuff and read about it, just to see Republicans embrace even the deficit that went along with this tax bill. I mean, my God, I covered the Tea Party movement. It was like one of the most interesting and underrated political movements of my lifetime because it was a group of people who stood for something, smaller government, lower deficits, and actually delivered. If you look at non-defense discretionary spending, they were successful. They came to do something very specific. And then suddenly those same members are voting for record-sized deficits that are going to be as big as the Obama deficits. Like, there's just people are just more capable of change than I ever would have thought. And there's still a huge disconnect. The establishment is still thinking the way you're thinking, but the establishment has no power. It really doesn't. And it's funny because a lot of the do-gooder stuff, and not to just be callous about this, but a lot of the do-gooder stuff kind of sucks for politics. Like earmarks. Yes, you shouldn't spend money on crappy projects because somebody gave you money. But you know what earmarks do? They actually allow you to grease a deal. You're able to get things done because there's a give and take that in previous generations we just didn't pay any attention to. Well, you took that away. You took soft money to the parties away. So now political parties don't have any power. Leadership doesn't have any power. So guess who has power? People on the outside who know how to use social media. People on the outside who have money and can spend money at the same, the Koch brothers can put together an organization and outspend the Republican National Committee. You can do that. Hell, if I were a multi-billionaire, I might do the same damn thing. It's kind of fun. You could be able to affect public policy with very little regulation. But that's just, it's changed. So the establishment, and Trump wasn't wrong, again here, about his critique of the establishment. They really did grow fat and lazy. They were not creative. They were not responding to the working man and woman inside the Republican Party. They were a little delusional about sort of their own power. So that critique rings true. And certainly to the voter, they all say, yes, it rings true. And it's a problem. Like there was yesterday in one of some of the off-year elections, some of the primaries yesterday, I think there's 3 different House members who are running in primaries, all lost. Well, what does that tell you? People are still sick and tired of Washington. If you're attached to Washington, they want you to get the hell out of there. And by the way, when you're thinking about your business, that volatility is not going away. Like, I don't mean to be a downer. This gets worse before it gets better. Meaning that you have now, I think, 4 straight elections that are change elections, where one of the houses, House, Senate, and the presidency changed hands. That didn't happen. We had years and years of stability. Remember, until 94, you had the House in Democratic control for 48 years or whatever it was. Now we're in a period of great volatility. Why? Because we have a 50-50 nation, and people are perpetually unsatisfied with whoever's in power. So they just keep turning it over and over, which I would say from a business perspective makes your planning a little bit harder because you don't actually know if a law is a law forever, right? You might get Obamacare, but Obamacare might get gutted, might get repealed. You might get Dodd-Frank, but it might get gutted, it might get repealed. Because you have so much change, that possibility is higher. So you have both the possibility of change and then just the possibility of long-term paralysis, which we might be stuck in now for 3 years, right? Where it'd be very hard to get anything done this year legislatively, hard to see the next 2 years anything getting done legislatively. And so it makes the planning that used to be much more certain that much more difficult.
Jim, do you talk about immigration a little bit more?
Yep.
I know you briefly mentioned it. Do you think anything happens on immigration? Do you think the president would shut down the government over the law and that kind of thing?
Yes, I think he would. Again, like in his mind, he made a couple of promises: get out of the Paris deal, clamp down on China, get out of the deal with Iran, and build the wall. He wants to build the wall, and I think he needs some kind of win in terms of money and actual parts of the wall getting built to be able to feel like he's fulfilled it. He really does see himself as a builder, and I think he wants to see actual parts of the wall in construction to feel vindicated. I will say, in terms of if you stack, this is the other thing about politics. If you just sat there and looked at government like it's a business, and you thought about your core strengths, your core weaknesses, and stuff you got to worry about, the wall between here and Mexico would not rank in your top 100 things that you should be obsessing about. There's just not that many people coming over compared to all the other threats that we have. And so our immigration debate, in some ways, is lopsided. Like, we're talking about whether or not we can curtail the flow of people from the southern border in, when I actually would argue, and you guys face this in manufacturing, we face it in media, certainly when I'm out in the Valley, they face it in profound ways. Like, we need more high-skilled people coming here, creating businesses, filling jobs. And it's a hard thing to sell in modern politics because the person who lost their job reacts so viscerally to it, and it's a hard thing to sell to them. But if you look at how we're at 4% unemployment. It does not happen. Again, it's like something Trump certainly deserves some credit for. You had 4% unemployment, and we have a lot of jobs. You talked about the 300,000 figure that you have just in manufacturing, but across the board where we don't have skilled people to do the jobs. You need people to do the jobs. And ultimately, long term, I still think it's in the best interest of our country to have as many good companies that create jobs and create value operating here versus operating in China. So making this a hospitable place for someone to start a company, to grow value and to create jobs, long term, when you think about engineering the country for greatness, that's kind of something you have to do. And instead, we're having, I say, a much narrower debate about immigration. That probably doesn't change. It's just, again, like that, the emotionalism. Again, I know everyone's busy and don't have time to always pay attention to what's happening in other nations, but very similar. It's just like the similar rhetoric, similar response, similar type candidates, and all of it does flow from that visceral feeling of I don't like the world that's before us. And by the way, I think it's wrong of the media to always say that because you feel that way, you're racist. I think, is there some racism? Yes, there's some racism. But I grew up in Oshkosh. My family's still in Oshkosh. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. A lot of it is, I grew up thinking that the world looks a certain way, that life is going to unfold a certain way, that I'm going to have a certain job, that I'm going to be at for a certain amount of time, and have a certain retirement. And all of that's been thrown up into the air. All of that doesn't exist for a hell of a lot of people. So it's not wrong for them to not like that and want to figure out ways to stop it. And then when someone comes along and says, I can magically stop it with a trade war, when in fact, well, no, if you actually look at the effects of some of these policies, they're actually hurting you probably more than they're helping you. But people don't look at it like a policy wonk. They look at it like we're emotional people. We're humans. And I think that's how people react. They react more viscerally.
Question?
Yes, sir.
The last several years have seen an acceleration of polarization in society. And you're a media guy, and I'll lay some of the blame at media because we can now read all our own facts, so to speak. There's right-wing news sites, left-wing news sites. Do you see any hope moving forward that the environment could somehow get less aggressive, right and left, and how the media could play a role in that, or is the media not going to be able to help solve that?
Well, one, I agree with you that the media deserves a lot of blame for it. I just feel like I should hand out antidepressants when I talk. I'm not hopeful in the short term. In fact, I'm pretty bearish in the short term. Long term, I think whatever, market's correct, we're a better country than anything else, we'll fix all this. In the short term, there's real problems because all politics is like, it's incentives, right? You're going to respond to like whatever gets you elected, whatever gets you money. There's no market in the middle. This idea like, oh, can't everyone just get along and like get in the middle and get some conservative Democrats and moderate, they don't exist. They don't get elected anymore. Because if you want to get elected and you want to get people to turn out at an event, or you want people to raise money for you, or you want people to follow you on Twitter, or you want to get on Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity, you got to say crazy stuff. And you got to take positions way out here. Very hard to live in the middle in politics. And all of those things, they're cooked into the system. Like Trump is not the cause of this. He's the effect of it. He's not the cause, he is the effect of it. Of what? Of a bunch of things that happened that were set in motion about a decade ago. Think about life before social media. So I was like, my demarcation zone is like 2007. That's when I sort of switched from being a journalist to being an entrepreneur. We started Politico in 2007. When we started the company, the iPhone still wasn't out. Like Google was tiny. Facebook was tiny. Instagram didn't exist. Snapchat didn't exist. Breitbart didn't exist. None of these companies existed. And so what happened when you had Facebook and Twitter in particular? Well, now every jackass with an opinion can find 1,000 or 1,000,000 people who say, you're right. Guess what happens when people say you're right? You say even crazier stuff. And you become even more confident in your craziness. And so before 10 years ago, you had nowhere to go. Go back 15 years ago, pre-cable, you didn't even have anyone to egg you on. You had like 3 boring down the middle, slightly left to center newscasts to look at 6 o'clock. Now you've got pure rage 24 hours a day. You're a liberal and you want to get all jazzed up. Like just go grab your Chablis and listen to Rachel Maddow late at night. Or if you're a Republican, grab your beer and listen to Sean Hannity because he's just so damn smart, right? Like and you're just getting jazz. Then guess what happens when you go on Facebook? And this is like one of the stories of the election people don't pay enough attention to. All Facebook does, all it does is look at what you do and give you more of it. So if you really hate Hillary, you're going to get a lot more Hillary hatred. You really hate Trump, you're going to get a lot more hatred of Trump. And guess what? Most people who voted got most of their news on Facebook. And on Facebook, it was extremely emotional news, and 19 of the 20 stories that were seen by the most number of people in that 1 month before the election were fake. Think about that. You wouldn't write that into a sci-fi novel. 19 of the 20 stories that most people who paid attention to news consumed weren't even real. And so all those things, they haven't changed. Twitter hasn't changed. Facebook hasn't fundamentally changed. Cable TV, if anything, its audience is growing. And then there's us. And I'd say we have taken the us out of this. We've taken the us out of this. We choose what to watch. We choose what to share. Like 60% of people share stories without reading them. Like we're just mindlessly sending crap around that reinforces, we think in our mind, our righteousness. And how do you undo that? Like basically the only way you change it is like everyone's like, how do I consume media? Own your life. It's not Facebook's fault or Twitter's fault or the New York Times' fault. Like, why don't you take the time to figure out what you're reading, where did it come from, can I trust it, should I share it? If each one of us did that one small thing, it could have a profound effect. The number of smart people I run into that repeat stupid, false things because they read it somewhere that they thought to be reputable. I read it on Facebook. Facebook's not a media company. Facebook, all it's doing is giving you a link to something else. If that something else is something you haven't heard of, maybe it's not real. And that is why I think polarization's really hard to solve, because it really was when I covered Congress in the 90s, and it really was, even with Clinton and Gingrich and all the craziness, it really was a lot of moderates on both sides. And when you had the debate, you had Republicans take a crazy position out here and Democrats take a crazy position out here because they knew they'd have to meet in the middle. Now Republicans take a crazy position out here and Democrats take a crazy position out here because they're authentically crazy. And so there isn't a middle ground. They're not faking it. They just live in different worlds. And one last thing on like our own personal responsibility, look at demographic trends. Look at your big cities. Like, you're seeing this huge congregation where like liberals are packing themselves in so damn tight into cities to get as far away from conservatives as humanly possible, and conservatives are running for the hills. And it's why you look at that big map after the election, and it's this massive sea of red and these little dots of blue. And those little dots just happen to be the biggest population centers in America, where liberals are getting more tightly packed in, and conservatives are moving away from people. So we're just, even the common associations of the bumping into people who don't share our views, that's cooked in. So to get rid of polarization, you somehow have to re-engineer those 4 or 5 things really quickly. What'll fix it or what'll change it is when we expect something different. We want a government that functions. We want a technocrat, or we want, I mean, it's hard to see that happening in the short term, but I will say, and Trump showed this, and this is where we can end on this. Trump showed this. Like, don't underestimate the power of the presidency. The ability of one person to have massive sway over tens of millions of people and get them to change their views. So the right person comes in and thinks about it differently, then maybe you do end up in an era of compromise. Or a third-party candidate takes the tricks of Donald Trump and comes in and governs not with one of the 2 parties, but just in trying to get done. Like, those are the outcomes, I think, that would have the quickest, most appreciable effect on politics. Hard to do in this environment, but not impossible. Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us.